My name's Alexis Baudron. I work at Sony. I'm doing research over there. And kind of covering a slightly different topic than everything we hear today. I'll be covering mobile computational photography. The aim is to give kind of like an overview of the fantastic things that happen in your phone. So we'll also try to reserve some space for questions at the end. So I don't know if you've picked up a DSLR camera anytime recently. I haven't personally. I've been using my phone to take pictures for the past couple of years, but there's some obvious hardware limitations between the two, right? So your mobile camera has got a tiny sensor compared to a full-frame DSLR. That tiny sensor has a very low dynamic range, so each pixel can actually take way less information. In terms of optics, you have very limited zoom because unlike a full-frame DSLR, you can't be changing the lenses and moving the lenses along. And then as well, you don't have an adjustable aperture, so it's a fixed aperture, which limits the sensor quite a lot. If you take a picture of your phone, you'll often see that you basically have an infinite depth of field, so you can't really focus into images. We've kind of tried to change that computationally and also tried to change a lot of other things computationally in the phone. So the ISP comes in and tries to fix all of these limitations, and that's kind of what we work on. So how do cameras see generally, right? So light comes into the lens, and you got this color filter array on top of the sensor. The sensor is taking all these photons, integrating them, and then converts that to electrons. Each pixel in the image only sees one specific wavelength of light. I don't know if you ever knew this. It's called the Bayer pattern. And through the ISP, this image that you can see, for example, this dark image that's a raw Bayer image prior to processing that doesn't look like much, goes through the ISP and you get this well-colored, well-lit, well-illuminated, denoised, sharpened image. And so we can, kind of the ISP is in charge of this entire process. In the ISP, every single image that we take goes through this ISP. And the ISP runs every single time that you take an image, and you basically don't even realize what's happening. You take the image and it loads in the background, and there's a lot of different algorithms that run. So you've, for example, some notable ones. You've got demosaicing, color manipulation, tone mapping, denoising, and every single smartphone manufacturer has a different approach on how they tune these algorithms. I hope no one from Apple is here, but Apple is quite famous for actually tuning their color quite strongly. So you get these very, very popping images that come out of Apple phones compared to other phones. And so, smartphones have kind of followed the same trend as generally. We've got more computational power, more GPUs, stronger CPUs. And so we've been able to do fancier and fancier stuff in the ISP or after the ISP. And the general aim is to try and get us as close as possible towards these larger format cameras where you have zoom, where you have in-focus planes. So, for example, the background is blurred. So Apple calls that, portrait mode. So, and many different examples of this. So going from left to right, you've got a good example of just computational bokeh. What an image on a phone would look like is this top left image, kind of this wide depth of field, all in focus image. And we try to transform it to this shallow depth of field image. This example of an image is actually taken with a DSLR. The way we do that is we actually have a network that takes a depth map, and then you apply a depth varying blur to the image. All of this is doing, of course, real time. Another type of example, if you ever zoom in on your camera on your phone, you'll realize, you get to the telephoto camera, which is usually 3x or 4x, depending on the phones. What happens after that is entirely computational, right? So there's a super resolution network that is being applied to the image and giving you this kind of sharp, zoomed in image that you see. And then finally, another very common piece of AI in the ISP is kind of this denoising component. And so it's actually quite difficult to denoise images on a phone. As I was saying before, the sensor is very small, which means we get less light. Of course, when you've got less light, you have a lower signal to noise ratio, right? So that means that you have very little light, you have the same amount of noise, for example, as any other sensor, but there's less light, so a lower signal-to-noise ratio. So most ISPs have a network that does the denoising inside of the phone. And so I'll kind of follow over and try to follow a toy example of denoising, especially low-light denoising in phones. So the main problem is, of course, we have very small pixels, so they can accumulate very little light. We have small fixed apertures, which let very little light through. And as you've probably realized, if you're trying to take long exposures with your phone, you're kind of moving around, and it makes it very, very difficult for the phone to not incorporate that motion. So generally, smartphones for a very long time, whenever you took images in the dark, they were very noisy. They weren't very bright. And kind of 4 years ago, 5 years ago, all of that changed as we've started having some stronger, computational methods that fix that. And so the general approach is that you take a burst of multiple images. And the reason why you take a burst is you'll switch between short exposure images and long exposure images. The long exposure images are going to integrate more light, but that means that some of the pixels will overfill and you'll also lose some detail. The shorter exposure images will have more detail, especially in these very high-lit regions, such as point lights or other types of very high-lit regions, but they'll have a much lower signal-to-noise ratio. So we align all these images throughout these exposures, and you'll see most phones these days, when you go into this low-light mode, it kind of has like a little loading thing. It's taking all these different exposures, right? And so it tries to force you not to move too much, or you'll have some ghosting issues and you'll have some movement issues in the image. Once we've aligned and merged all these images, all these exposures together, we're going to send that image through the ISP. The ISP, as I was saying before, demosaicing, color correction, la-di-da, and then, of course, the denoising network. And so that denoising network, these days, we take this denoising network and we basically entirely implement it using PyTorch. And so that's kind of what I'm going to go into today. All the way from the dataset preparation, where we're using torch.utils dataset, torch.tensor, to model training, and end.module, optim, and of course torch.distributed, which allows us to train our models on a lot of different GPUs and iterate very fast. And then all the way to model deployment, of course, quantizing the model and then converting that over to Onyx. And so, as I was saying, it allows us this very, very quick iteration. So this is a kind of like a sample UNet architecture, just a very classic image-to-image translation model. Very different than everything we've been talking about today in terms of LLMs. But, as I was mentioning this quick iteration, we can iterate very quickly on the blocks and the architectures that we're trying to train. We've got an example here of switching the channel attention from just this very simple channel attention and then all the way to mobile MQA, which has been recently presented by MobileNet v4. So this kind of a mobile multi-query attention. And so, yeah, flexibility of using PyTorch to be able to quickly iterate on our network architecture. That's all for today. It was very quick, but please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much.